And let's start. And welcome everyone to join today's seminar. I know some people will join in later. I don't have much to emphasize, but like usual, if you have questions, you can. I encourage you to ask question at the end, and you can turn on the camera if you are using Zoom. And always you have the option to use chat. And if you are in the auditorium, just I can hand the mic to you, or you can just come up to the questions. I will have the Dr. Wild to introduce our today's speakers. Please, Mark.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's great. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Mariana Chilton. She's professor of health management and policy at the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University. She founded the Center for Hunger-Free Communities and also Witnesses for Hunger, a movement to increase women's participation in the national dialogue on hunger and poverty, which is known especially for the photographic layperson journalism that shares what are people's experiences on the ground with hunger in the United States. She's the principal investigator of the Building Wealth and Health Network, designed to incentivize entrepreneurship and self-sufficiency in the TANF program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. For 15 years, she was a co-PI in Children's Health Watch, which is a multi-city project on hunger in low-income families with children, which has a strong Boston connection with the Boston Medical Center. She served as co-chair of the Bipartisan National Commission on Hunger, which advised Congress and the United States on nutrition assistance policy. And this is a bipartisan commission that I teach in my class on US food policy because of the interesting conversation that was required between, as she was a co-chair nominated by the Democratic legislators, and there was a Republican counterpart, and it required a very interesting negotiation and finding common ground on how nutrition assistance could meet multiple goals in the United States. She's testified before the US Senate and the US House of Representatives, and has served as an advisor to Sesame Street and the Institute of Medicine. She's also been very generous with her time and mentorship on a couple different things at the Friedman School. In Witnesses for Hunger has been helpful to a USDA NIFA project that we've got going on the cost of healthy food. But most importantly, she's on the advisory committee for a USDA Economic Research Service funded project that I direct that has given small grants to researchers around the country for research on how food security is measured in the United States. So as you hear the talk today, you could imagine Dr. Chilton in the sort of workaday type setting of trying to review proposals and using that as an opportunity to share with the other colleagues on the advisory committee some wisdom about the deeper moral issues that are at stake as we think about what seems like a technical measurement challenge and are reflecting on what makes the US a just or an unjust society. So as she says in the abstract, today's talk is a provocation. And I hope, although you can't always hear it by Zoom, I hope that she has a sense of the applause as we look forward to your talk today, Mariana.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction. I'm really honored to be here talking with you at Tufts. Just so you know about my background, I'm an ethnographer or a folklorist and an epidemiologist, and you will see my unique perspective coming through my talk today. Before I get started, I want to recognize that I'm speaking to you from Zoom in the land of the Cahuilla people, which is in Southern California in the mountains, and I honor their ancestors past, present, and future, and we ought to give the land back in California. And those of you who are in Massachusetts, focusing in on the Massachusetts people, the Wampanoag, they should have their land back too, and we should be honoring their ancestors as well, past, present, and future. It's really important to honor our relationships to land and to people. And I also want to honor the research participants that have worked with me over the years and that have taught me so much, something that I learned from Southern Cheyennes and Arapahoes with whom I worked early in my career, is that we need to be in sacred relationship with each other, and that we have to always recognize our sacred human bonds. It's a part of being a part of the natural world. And so I've learned so much from the research participants in our studies at the Center for Hunger-Free Communities, and I hope I do right by them today. Also, this is an opportunity to give you a gentle heads up that what's coming ahead is some discussion of exposure to violence, rape, child abuse and neglect, enslavement, genocide, and more. So feel free to tune out at any time or come back when you're feeling better. Take good care of yourself as we move forward. Okay, so I also want to acknowledge the context of COVID-19, of the pandemic, and there's a wonderful video by Arundhati Roy called "We Need a Reckoning." I highly recommend it. It's only 6 minutes long, and she asks, are we dying or are we being born? And if we are being born, then our rage must turn insurrectionary, revolutionary. In other words, we can no longer accept a life where we are denied access to healthcare, denied access to food, where we should all be having basic income. We should all have access to good shelter and good education. I hope to not disappoint you today on the insurrection, but keep it in the backdrop, because I'm sure all of us are changed by the global pandemic, and I'm no exception. Okay, so here's my overview of what's going to happen today. This is a provocation, and it's a provocation to help us evolve, because if we are being born, we have to come out of this pandemic differently. And it's going to take a lot of courage, and a lot of wisdom, a lot of self-wisdom, and a lot of open ears and open heart. I'm going to tell you about my research trajectory. I'll talk about the exposure to violence that I started to learn through my food insecurity research. I'll talk about racism and discrimination, and I'll propose to you some transformative solutions, and I will land on human rights and the rights of nature. I hope I get there. But what I'm going to do first is just give you a quick overview of food insecurity. It means lack of access to enough food for an active and healthy life. It has two components: not having enough of the food, and also it has health components, with deep health concerns with depression, physical health, emotional health. And just so that you know, I'll be using food security terminology today. Primarily, I'll be talking about food insecurity. And this is, I used the US Household Food Security Survey module, which is an 18-point scale. And if I'll just focus in on low food secure, means that 3 or 7 positive yeses to questions about food insecurity means reduced quality, variety, and desirability of diet. Very low food security means 8 or more reports of lots of different indications of disrupted eating patterns, reduced food intake, etc. It's a more severe form of household food insecurity. But I want us to remember that marginal food security also has major health impacts, and that just could be an indication of anxiety about not having enough money for food. And the key is anxiety creates a lot of troubles with emotional and mental health. And this is an old slide, but I'm using it for you to give you some background that household food insecurity is associated with fair or poor child health, increased hospitalization for young children. This comes from our Children's Health Watch research, and I'll mention that in a second. Notice here the very high odds of maternal depressive symptoms, and also it has an impact on child development. In the Children's Health Watch study, which is a multi-site epidemiological study that's been going on for over 20 years, we've talked about the interplay between household food insecurity, housing insecurity, that means being late on rent or mortgage, or not being able to pay your rent or mortgage, or moving from house to house throughout the year. We also look at energy insecurity, which may be using the stove to heat the home, being late on utility bills. It's this trifecta of insecurities, economic insecurities, that lands a child into the hospital. This is an old slide I use that often I used to talk about toxic stress during childhood. It affects the brain architecture, affects the organs, it affects the full body of a person that they then bring into adulthood if it's not addressed right away. So Children's Health Watch is a multi-site study that I was involved in for many years. The Philadelphia site is still ongoing. I turned it over to my colleague, Felice Lescherbon, who's an epidemiologist. So it's still active. Please, if you're interested in Children's Health Watch research, connect. You have some, I see that Kurt Hager is on the line and is at Friedman School. There are many people around in Boston working on Children's Health Watch. Please connect with them at the Boston Medical Center. What we do is we look at the impact of public policy and on the health and well-being of young children and their caregivers, and that manifests through food insecurity, hospitalizations, child well-being, maternal depressive symptoms, child growth, etc. So I'm just going to give you where I'm going to land in case anybody needs to dive out or wants to do quick screenshots and move along before I get into the tough stuff. I talk about 3 domains of solutions. What we tend to focus on in food insecurity research is SNAP. We tend to focus on food and maybe economics. So we talk about improving the SNAP benefit program, and shout out to the Food and Nutrition Services at the USDA for increasing the SNAP benefit allotment. That was absolutely huge what happened this fall, in 21% increase in the SNAP benefit calculation of Thrifty Food Plan. That I can't wait to see some of you all doing some research on the impact of that increase on household food insecurity and health and well-being. We focus on school meals. We'll focus, some of us may focus on minimum wage, increasing minimum wage. These are policy asks that we talk about, making sure that people have a good tax credit, family leave, labor laws, et cetera. So that's, I consider to be the standard approach, but I'm insisting that that's still working around the edges. What I'm asking us to do is to start to bring in more of our own hearts, because we were going to recognize after today, you'll have no question that household food insecurity is rooted in the history of enslavement and genocide in this country and ongoing racism and discrimination. So in order to address that, we need to be advancing policy solutions that help us to decolonize, that include reparations, where we undo our own whiteness, that we have trauma-informed care, and that we end our rape culture. And I have to say that we need a whole lot more courage in what we're asking for in terms of policy asks to reduce and prevent household food insecurity. We need to just jump straight out of SNAP and get into universal basic income. We need to talk more about universal health care, universal child care, abolition of police and prisons, and also investing more in the solidarity economy, which resists capitalism, because capitalism itself, racial capitalism especially, is a driver of household food insecurity. So I'm suggesting that we need some more courage, and that's a little picture of guts. Anyway, it's about getting in right relationship with each other, right relationships with ourselves, and in right relationship with the natural world and with our food. We need to start thinking about our food as persons. Okay, knowing that we're in the midst of a climate catastrophe, we're at the edge of the 6th great mass extinction, in which human beings are also we're on the list for extinction. I invite you to check out an article I have with Catherine Alaimo and Sonia Jones in the Present Knowledge of Nutrition, the most recent handbook that came out in January of 2020. This is an image that we had in there trying to advance the rights of nature. I'll help you get there. Don't worry. You don't have to buy it yet. Anyway, that's my talk. If you want to tune out, you're welcome to go. Those are the solutions. What I'm going to do now is tell you how I got there. Okay. So the Center for Hunger-Free Communities, we founded it in 2004. But before we started that center, a lot of my work was grounded in Indigenous wisdom, Indigenous knowledge, primarily working with Southern Cheyenne and Arapahoes. When I first came to Philadelphia, I was doing research at the food pantries. It was primarily qualitative and reciprocal. And in the question and answer, I'm happy to talk about those methods. I founded the center in 2004. That's when I joined in with Children's Health Watch. I also started a grow clinic that was modeled off of Dr. Deborah Frank's grow clinic at the Boston Medical Center. And that is ongoing. The grow clinic is still happening at St. Christopher's Hospital for Children. In 2008, I started Witnesses to Hunger, which is a participatory action program to make sure that people who have experienced hunger and poverty firsthand, especially women of color, can speak directly to legislators and policymakers, the public and the press about their experiences. Throughout my time in running these longer, bigger studies, I've been doing smaller studies that are spin-offs looking at childhood stress, childhood hunger. In 2014, I started the Building Wealth and Health Network with an extraordinary team of people. And I miss it so much. We started a cafe, which is a community cafe called the Eat Cafe, which stands for Everyone at the Table. And we were open for 2.5 years where people could come in and have a 3-course meal and pay whatever they could. And it was a way to take off the stress, no means test, no eligibility criteria other than just being a human being and wanting to eat. And the food was delicious and wonderful. And I miss the staff and the people who used to come to the cafe. So that's my trajectory. All of this is going on in the backdrop of where I'm going to land you now. Quick shout out to my staff. You can't do this work alone. This incredible, so many beautiful, beautiful people have come through the Center for Hunger-Free Communities. I'm so grateful for the staff and the partners that we've had over the years. None of this work is something that I do alone. I do it in community with people. I do it in solidarity with staff and students, other faculty and community members. And just a big shout out to them and the joy that they bring. Okay. So here we are skating on the surface, and this is an image that I've used in a number of my talks. So sorry if it's a repeat for some of you. The Peanuts characters that are skating around at the beginning of this little GIF are what I consider to be food insecurity researchers, primarily with training in nutrition or economics. They've all got skates, but there's Snoopy has no skates, and this is what happens when you let a folklorist into your midst. Don't need some skates. Doing their own thing, part of the group, but oh, what's happening to Snoopy? Maybe Snoopy is falling through the ice. And that's my invitation to all of you. Let's see what's underneath the ice. And I understand it's supposed to snow this afternoon. So this little girl is going to help you with my transitions. I just want to bring you back to my work with Indigenous folks. This is the entrance to Concho, Oklahoma. I started to learn directly from people who were Southern Cheyenne and Arapahoes. I was hanging around ceremonies and learning from them about an ethics of care and caring. And as I said at the outset, the relationships that you build through doing your work and in solidarity with people are very sacred. And so nothing that we do should ever be something considered to be separate from us. And the people that we work with are a part of who we are. They are our kin. They deeply informed my work, and you'll see that coming through. And this is why I can land on the rights of nature. So one of the first studies that I ran in Philadelphia when I came was in the food pantries of Philadelphia. I worked primarily with women, learning about what is the experience of hunger and poverty. And it was from them that I learned that you can't separate household food insecurity from everything else that's going on in the household. You can't separate it from the body. You can't separate it from the mind and from the spirit. And I want to show you a gift that was given to me by a participant in this particular research study who came to my office a year later and showed up with this gift. She said, Mariana, I made this painting for you because it reminds me of our conversation about what that experience of hunger is like. Even the nothing that I had was falling apart. Notice that the barrel is falling apart. The nail is coming out. And I asked her, who is this? She said, oh, this is a picture of me when I had nothing. And what is that experience of hunger? And I want to draw your attention to the orange and green in her body. That is stress. Call it what you want. Toxic stress, deep depression. It affects all of the organs. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, so remember I showed you how food insecurity is related to depression, and there's a lot of folks who do this kind of work of trying to disentangle. Which comes first, depression or food insecurity? I'm here to tell you that you cannot disentangle, and that's the members of Witnesses to Hunger who've taught me that. So I'm going to bring you through a bunch of different qualitative and quantitative studies that I've done over the years to demonstrate to you what's underneath that relationship between food insecurity and depression, and that's sexual violence and economic violence and perpetration, adverse childhood experience, quantitative measure. There's an intergenerational transfer. We often measure food insecurity in time units of 12 months or 30 days. I'm telling you, it goes way back. I'll tell you how I got there. And then there's also quantitative measures of discrimination that you can use. So you can look at it in terms of adulthood, childhood, dynamics in the family, and also in our systems in our society, which brings me to constantly be focusing on toxic stress and trauma and creating solutions that help to heal that violence. So just to ground us in the experience and the wisdom of people I've worked with, this is a woman I interviewed who had very low food security. I asked her, what is this relationship? Can you please explain it? I just don't understand how they're related. She said, you cannot ask a person, why are you stressing? You cannot ask a person, why is there so much violence here? You cannot ask a person, why are you hungry? No matter how you see it, all three go together. Like, okay, I'm stressing because I don't have no food, and it's violent because I'm fighting my husband because we need money. So it's a refusal to disentangle, to find out which comes first. They come together as a bundle. Okay, so I'm going to bring you into Witnesses to Hunger. These are some of the members of Witnesses to Hunger that have taught me so much over the years. I consider them to be my professors, my original professors. So much wisdom, and I'm just grateful for what they've taught me. Witnesses to Hunger was participatory action. The research piece was primarily ethnographic, doing participatory action. We used photo voice. We were looking at the relationships between food insecurity and public assistance, poor health, maternal depression. But we were constantly trying to figure out how we can take action. What is the advocacy that we can do? So they utilized their exhibits, the photographs, created speaking engagements, formal testimony, speaking directly with the press. We have a website, a blog. We wanted to have an active YouTube channel. It's not that active anymore. And we're also on social networks. So here's just like a composite of what happens. That's Imani Sullivan. She's a research participant. That's her photograph of her son at the county assistance office. That's the research piece. And she's talking directly to Senator Bob Casey, who's a US Senator for Pennsylvania, who's served on the Senate Ag Committee for many years. This is the action piece of the research. So you can get a feel for what really actually happens. The exhibits themselves were platforms through which members of Witnesses could engage directly with legislators and the public. The methodology used participatory action. We used one-on-one semi-structured interviews based on photographs. This was before iPhones. So back in 2008, everybody got a Canon PowerShot, which cost $200. And they would take photographs and I would ask them three main questions. Why did you take the picture? What do you want people to see? And what do you want people to do? So there's the action part. We did focus groups so people could come together and decide how they wanted their exhibits to run, what kind of panels that we would do. It was constantly reciprocal, getting lots of feedback. And we had a lot of ongoing relationships. We used Atlas TI to help us with our analyses of we did families of codes, super codes, network analyses, clustering of different themes and ideas that came through the videos, the recorded interviews, and the photographs. Okay. This is some of the examples of people speaking out for Witnesses to Hunger. There's Secretary Vilsack, who is currently the Secretary of the United States Department of Agriculture. He's been at it a long time. There's a member of Witnesses in the back listening to him. You can see her holding her camera. And these are some of the members of Witnesses at the State House. We had an exhibit at the State House many years ago. And we always love the idea of women taking over the seats of power. So we have been in Boston and you do see our traces around. That's Tiana Gaines Turner testifying in front of the House Budget Committee when Paul Ryan was running that before he became Speaker of the House and before he resigned or didn't run again. So just to give you a feel for how close we have been to different seats of power, and it can be done. I'll show you some of the photographs and I'll get back to exposure to violence and trauma. This is a photograph that was at the beginning of my talk. This is a photograph by Crystal Sears. She said, I took this picture because I wanted people to see that thanks to food stamps, my daughter was able to eat today. So it was a great assessment of the food stamps and how it helped her to feed her child. But the context all around is still pretty hard. Lots of suffering. Photograph here by Whitney Henry. This is a picture of blood on the street. She said, look at the blood on the street, Mariana. There's so much violence in our community. I'm so tired of it. It's so stressful for me. It affects my daughter. She's 2 years old walking past us. We were on our way to the bus stop. We need to end gun violence and other kinds of violence. And this is another photograph by a member of Witnesses who turned the camera on herself to talk about deep experiences with depression. And the pain, the deep pain. Do you want you to see the pain? I don't think that we see enough of it. Those of us who do food insecurity research, we are not talking enough about the pain, which is why I'm suggesting that we bring it in our heart and our guts. Okay, so it was really thanks to the members of Witnesses who continued to insist that I not separate out food insecurity from exposure to trauma and violence. Some of the issues that were coming up were experiences with rape and sexual assault, intimate partner violence. The women that I talked to talk about being neglected and abused when they were children, exposure to community violence, and I'm adding in there a lot of mistreatment by caseworkers, which is a form of systemic violence. There's maybe not a gunpoint, but it's still a violent experience of stigma and discrimination that they talked a lot about. So what is trauma? It's an emotional, cognitive, physical, and spiritual and relational response to a terrible event, like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. It is also something that is found in enslavement and colonization. These can be massive experiences of trauma that create trauma across the generations. So if, in your past, you've had ancestors that were tortured, starved to death, imprisoned, that comes through the generations. So at the individual level or interpersonal relationships, you can think about, rape, physical abuse, sex trafficking, etc. It's really important to remember that trauma can be historical and intergenerational. So historical trauma is the cumulative psychological and emotional wounding that happens across generations. So, and that's what happens for Indigenous folks. It's like a soul wound. And so a lot of Indigenous folks today are still suffering from historical trauma. It's not something that happened in the past. It's something that they carry with them today. Then there's intergenerational trauma, which can happen through specific families, and collective trauma, like a cataclysmic event, such as COVID-19, massive war, mudslides, wildfires, etc. It's important to remember that it's extremely severe, it's ongoing, and it's a total identity threat. It is not like a lot of people sort of overuse the word trauma these days. The way I'm using it today is a very serious, very cataclysmic set of experiences. So trauma and adversity creates changes in the neurological and brain landscape, creates major mental health problems, poor self-regulation, inability to focus, flashbacks, etc. So hyperarousal, a lot of people might think about flee, I forget, it just flew out of my mind. Freeze or flight, fight, flight, or freeze. Today I'm on freeze. I froze for a second. So another thing that exposure to trauma affects is also financial stability, because if you have all of these other things happening to you physically, emotionally, spiritually, of course it's going to affect your ability to earn money, to do well in school, in order to earn more money, those kinds of things. So a lot of us who do work on trauma talk about what we see at the tip of the icebergs, behavioral challenges, physical illness. This is where we're measuring food insecurity and housing insecurity, and where we're skating around on the surface. What's underneath all of this? Trauma and loss, adverse childhood experiences, I'll define that in a second, societal and family dysfunction, and historical trauma. All right, adverse childhood experiences is a 10-point scale where you can ask an adult to think about their childhood and what happened to them in childhood. Did they experience abuse, neglect, or household instability? These are some of the domains, sexual abuse, physical neglect, mental illness, having a parent who was incarcerated. And I pull out an example question of emotional abuse. And that question goes, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? So picking up so much of what was, the last thing, just so you know, ACEs is associated with all kinds of health problems and poor job performance. All right, so picking up on what I learned from members of Witnesses to Hunger, I thought, well, I can't seem to get any traction in the food insecurity world talking about trauma and violence through my qualitative research. Maybe through the quantitative research, I might be able to penetrate the ice in people's thinking and cognitive understanding of food insecurity. So we integrated the adverse childhood experiences measure into Children's Health Watch several years ago in Philadelphia. And we picked up about over 1,200 people over several years in Philadelphia. And I just want to show you what this looks like, how ACEs is associated with household food insecurity. So the yellow bar is those who are food secure. And this is not surprising that people who are food secure might report adverse childhood experiences. And actually, these rates are pretty on par with the national rates of exposure to adverse childhood experiences. But watch when the severity of food insecurity is noted here. Watch how low food security increases the percentage of reports of adverse childhood experiences. And what happens with very low food security, the most severe form, is a doubling or a tripling in the rates of reports of adverse childhood experiences. And I focus in on emotional neglect. right here. It's something deeply troubling, this emotional neglect. So I hope we can talk about that in the question and answer. Just learning again from members of Witnesses to Hunger about the intergenerational transfer. I have a few little studies, qualitative studies that I've looked at how I can pick up 5 generations of food insecurity and violence with asking if a person has experienced household food insecurity in the past year. So we have to change our time orientation when we're thinking about food insecurity. It is very likely transferred across the generations. I asked Letitia to describe that for me because she talked a lot about her own childhood and how rough it was. She had experienced a lot of rape and violence during her childhood and adulthood and reported very low food security. And this is her explanation. It was kind of a long explanation, and I'm going to reduce it to arrows. She said, if a parent is hungry and has experienced a lot of rape and violence, their kids are going to experience hungry. When a kid is hungry, they're either angry or lethargic or both at the same time and have a really hard time self-regulating. Like when you, as all of us know, when we're hungry, we get agitated, impatient, etc., which can create a lot of, create the conditions for violence in the home. When there's violence in the home, a person can start to have very low self-esteem, start to feel like they're worth nothing, that they will be nothing, they can't do well in school, they might turn to drug addiction and crime. These are not straight lines. This is sort of a propensity. It's what happens often, not always, but often. And when those kids become adults, as they become parents, they have kids, that then they transfer on hunger and homelessness. It's more complicated than that, but that's just a quick overview. Lastly, there are ways you can measure experiences with discrimination. Thanks to Nancy Krieger, there are many others who have measured it. But there are ways you can find out about experiences with discrimination at school, at work, getting housing, getting medical care, being discriminated against by police or in the courts. So we integrated the experiences of discrimination also into Children's Health Watch research. I'm skipping all kinds of things on methods, and I'm landing straight on the results. If you look at the results for household food insecurity in looking at experiences of discrimination, and you can just look at the top line of discrimination from police or in the courts, there is a 2.5-fold increase in reports of household food insecurity. The first model is controlled for all of the normal things that we control for, marital status, Medicaid coverage, how many years in the United States, household size. Then in model 2, we included adverse childhood experiences that actually reduced the odds a little bit. The third model is what I want you to pay attention to. We threw in also TANF assistance, SNAP, and WIC to see if nutrition assistance or public assistance reduced or attenuated the impact of the relationship of experiences of discrimination and household food insecurity, and it had negligible effects. So this is concerning, something that we need to pay attention to. Okay, ultimately, last transition, thinking about what draws all people together with the highest rates of food insecurity. Indigenous nations have the highest rates of household food insecurity, Black and African American families, households headed by women. That should make you think about gender dynamics in this country, people with disabilities, immigrants, people who are LGBTQIA, people returning from prison. What do they all have in common? Experiences of discrimination. So why aren't we focusing more on this in our food insecurity research? If we know that violence and injustice are creating racism and discrimination, create disrupted relationships, poor school performance, poor job performance, poor physical mental health, precarious living conditions, we know that that's related to economic insecurity. We're measuring food insecurity, housing insecurity, energy insecurity, and most of us are focusing in on poor health and the dynamics of food insecurity or housing insecurity and poor health. We're still just skating along the surface. And that what happens is we tend to think about food and economics or biomedical approaches. And I'm insisting that this is just a law of diminishing returns. Yes, it may attenuate. Yes, it may help for a minute, but you're still going to have food insecurity recreating itself because we're not touching the underneath. My encouragement to all of you, an invitation to all of you, is to do more transformative types of approaches, more intervention studies that are focusing in on violence and injustice to break that relationship between the injustice and all of the struggles that happen up top. So you can focus in on healing-based solutions, trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed policymaking. I'm not going to cover it because I want us to have a conversation today about what's going on in the world and what we ought to be doing. So I'm not going to touch all of these details. Oh, the last thing I wanted to say is that I am working on not the last thing. I did want to include that I'm working on a book that's under contract with MIT Press, and I'm giving you a little slice and giving you a piece of the MRI of that book, which I'm hoping will come out before the end of the year. So trauma-informed practice realizes that the widespread impact of trauma and that there are paths to recovery, that you can recover from trauma if you get the right types of therapy and supports. You can have organizational practices that recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma and that responds to the experiences of trauma is by not penalizing people, but creating a healing environment, and that resists any kind of re-traumatization. And I insist that the county assistance offices across the country need to become trauma informed. I put up the sanctuary model here because I work with Sandy Bloom, who's at Drexel University. We utilize her model. And another thing I want to say is that a good way to test whether you're on the right path is to engage with people that you're working with and studying who've had direct experiences with trauma and adversity or whatever else that you might be working on. And if they buy it, not only buy it, but if they are capable of presenting on it and being the expert on it, then you know that you're on the right track. And this is a picture of Sharita Mozon, who continues to insist that trauma and food insecurity are related. And I'm just really grateful for her continuing to work with us. Okay, we were able to create a trauma-informed, healing-centered program called the Building Wealth and Health Network. And I'm going to show you how I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. We were focusing on the injustice and the economic insecurity to create more peace and justice in their hearts, in their families, in their communities, to promote economic security. I say it's a 16-week thing. It started out at 16 weeks. We've condensed it. It's still 16 sessions. And we do two things. We focus in on the trauma and we focus in on economics and the finances. So in the trauma-informed peer support piece, we focus in on issues of safety, emotional management, managing loss and letting go, dealing with a lot of grief, helping people work through their grief, and developing a sense of future and a sense of freedom. This is the trauma piece, and it's a peer support. It's a circle of like a healing type of a circle. We also help people open bank accounts. We encourage them to save money, and whatever money they save, we match it to help people build their wealth, to help to create a sense of abundance, a sense of flourishing. We also help people understand how to read their credit score, how to do some business planning for their side hustle so that they can recognize themselves as a CEO, not as someone who's slumming the system, but actually as a CEO, as an entrepreneur. We help people also learn how to negotiate with their boss and set financial goals. And these are some of the other members of the Building Wealth and Health Network. This program is ongoing. We've worked with over 2,000 people in the Philadelphia area. We've been in Philadelphia and in rural areas of Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. We're also starting to work with young people in Atlantic City in New Jersey. And this is just some of our results. We have a number of studies, a number of papers on the Building Wealth and Health Network. But I wanted to show you this one because we were able to compare those who participated in our program and compared them to people who started our program but didn't continue to participate. The groups were actually quite similar. And we found that overall, we were able to reduce the odds of household food insecurity by 64%. We broke it out by ACEs to make sure that we're really helping those who experience the highest rates of trauma and adversity. And this is true, it was still significant for those who had 4 or more ACEs or 1 to 3 ACEs. You'll notice that it was non-significant among the folks who didn't have a lot of adverse childhood experiences, didn't have any. You can learn more about how this actually worked, but something I want to point out to you, we were able to reduce household food insecurity and depression actually without food and without any pills. So there's some interesting little ways of doing things in there, which I consider to be very heart-centered, very courageous, and focusing in on the trauma and on the healing. All right, so back to the 3 domains of solution. A part of, and I'm going to talk just about the love-centered types of things that we should be doing together, more trauma-informed care, focusing in on decolonization, pushing for reparations, undoing whiteness, ending rape culture, and also I'll talk a little bit about universal basic income. Okay. Decolonize is actually quite complex and is incommensurate with like reality of who we are, but we have to continue to recognize that almost 2 billion acres of land were stolen from indigenous people. All of us are on indigenous land in the United States. We need to learn more about it. And as we do that, if we're decolonizing, we have to reconsider our relationship with land, water, and food. And I think we ought to take something out of the wisdom, learn from the wisdom of the Ojibwe people who have been trying to fight the construction of Pipeline 3 that has gone through or has threatened their waterways, threatened their land, and also threatens their indigenous sovereignty. They have started to view their rights as a person. Manoman, now actually they're harnessing the concept of the rights of nature to try to get the legal world to think about their sovereignty and also to think about rights as persons, rights as having rights. Another example is Robin Wall Kimmerer talking about the honorable harvest. She talks about we need to reestablish or to create a covenant of reciprocity with our food and with the natural world. We have to use everything we take, leave some for others, harvest in ways that minimize harm to the planet and minimize harm to the food. We have to get into right relationship, more reciprocal relationship with the planet. I don't want to get too deep into reparations, but reparations is way beyond compensation for descendants of people who were enslaved in this country. It is not just about dealing with the mental and physical harm and lost opportunities through financial reparations, but also rehabilitation, more access to medical care, psychological care, access to legal aid and social services, also addressing truth and satisfaction. The United States government should create a public apology and acknowledge the facts, make sure that this discussion of racism and the history of colonization, the history of enslavement needs to be taught in our schools. And the United States has to accept responsibility and also insist that there will be no repetition of enslavement. Another aspect of decolonization and reparations is dealing with white people really need, especially, a lot of us use white supremacy culture. We have to start undoing this tendency that we have to focus only in on worshiping the written word and only thinking about objectivity as if it's like a real thing. It's not real. Hoarding power, it's a constant sense of urgency. These are different kinds of poisons that I encourage you to go to Tema Okun's website on white supremacy culture. And it's not just white people who harness this way of doing. There are a lot of people of color who often use this kind of a thing because this has been something to consider to be normalized, but it's actually a very pathological way of doing and being in the world. Another thing I want white folks to do and people who are harnessing white supremacy culture, especially in doing our research, is we need to unfreeze ourselves. We need to engage with our emotions, have more empathy and more sense of connectedness. We need to engage in alternative methods of inquiry. We need to get beyond the white Western European way of thinking and doing research. We need to think about doing indigenous methods or bringing in concepts of Afrofuturism into our inquiry, into our work with community folks. And we need to get some courage. An abolition framework, this is something more on the gut related type of a thing. A lot of people have a really hard time understanding what this really means, and I can't get into the details today. But it's really about trying to dismantle the systems that are actively oppressing people. At the same time, working, dreaming, thinking, and enacting, and designing, and creating new ways of being. This is about evolving, right? This is insurrection, revolution. If we are being born, how are we going to evolve? How are we going to grow in the future? It's Black power centric. It highlights and engages with indigenous sovereignty. It's non-binary, it's very womanist, borderless, very imaginative. And a lot of Black women have been the ones who have been pushing this forward, all the way back to Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, so many more, Du Bois. There's a long history in the United States of working on abolition. It's also a framework. It's also understanding that public assistance itself can be a healing type of experience. It doesn't have to have a means test. We ought to abolish the boundary between the wealthy and the poor. It also focuses in on alternative ways of dealing with gender-based violence and child abuse. So it does help us to handle and address issues of rape culture to change our culture. Lastly, universal basic income, just so that you're aware of it, is an important concept that is reignited in the conversation and the national dialogue in the United States. There are two different ways of thinking about it. There's one way is guaranteed income, and that's eligibility for a guaranteed income for people who meet certain criteria. So the child tax credit is targeted towards people who have children, right? So that's called a guaranteed income. Universal basic income provides a financial floor for everyone, regardless of who they are, regardless of any kind of eligibility criteria other than just being human. Pilot studies across the country and around the world show that either guaranteed income or universal basic income reduce household food insecurity, improves mental health, and it has no impact on whether people seek out employment. And thanks to the mayor of Cambridge, there will be a guaranteed income pilot starting up near you if it hasn't already started already. I lost my little cursor. There we go. Lastly, we really need to be preparing for a climate catastrophe. We need to focus in on food as a fundamental human right. And we need to start changing the way that we think about the planet. We need to recognize that the planet is a living being. These are just some examples. I'm sorry to be so quick, hoping you can take a screenshot and learn more about it. There are a lot of international rights covenants that are starting to put together human rights and rights of nature together. That's indigenous sovereignty, and also the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People working in rural areas. Finally, we need a whole lot more love and loving kindness in our day-to-day, in academia and in the world in general, and in our policymaking. And you'll have to wait for the book to learn more about how I think about loving kindness. Thank you very much for listening in, and I look forward to the conversation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
We actually have a round of applause here, but because muted, you cannot really hear. Okay, the question floor is open. Anyone have questions? Please turn on your camera, and we'll ask question in the chat. And if you are in the auditorium, please raise your hand. I can hand the microphone to you. Okay.
So I don't know if others have questions. Mariana, that was very interesting, and I'm keen to hear more about the book. So if you can share the title, which I don't think you said, and anything more you'd want to say about what motivated you to write this as a book and who you're trying to reach with it. I'd just love to hear more about that.
Thanks so much for the question, and it's nice to see you. The original title, the working title, was called Hunger Memos, New Ways of Nourishing Our World. But I've changed that because the concept of a memo, I think, is a way of relating to people that's a very white supremacist frame. What I wanted to do with the book was to get people on the same page about the exposure to violence and injustice that's underneath household food insecurity. So I wanted people to get the memo, and I wanted people to walk around and say, hey, did you get the memo? So that was just me riffing off of my original ideas, but it doesn't really work. I actually think it's more like love letters to invite us to transform ourselves and transform our way of doing. So I don't have a new title yet. This is under contract with MIT Press. Depending on how people review it and see it, it will hopefully will come out by the end of the year. My intention behind writing the book was to not have to race through all of these issues that I just raced through, from A to B, and which is a sense of urgency, which I don't really like. So it's about giving people more time to really engage with what's going on underneath. And I felt like it was an opportunity to make sure that the women that I've spoken with have opportunities to really have people to really engage in their own sense of rhythm, to listen into their voices. And I know you can't really do that through a book. I'm hoping to create a comic book after that and maybe a bunch of videos. So we'll see how it goes. So it's the idea of trying to get people to change the way we're doing it. It takes time. It takes a certain kind of slowness, which a book invites.
Thank you.
There's one question in the auditorium.
Hi, great. Yeah, thank you. And looking forward to the comic book. One question for you is to just go a little bit deeper on some of the things that you touched on. In terms of trauma-informed practice, you mentioned early on that some of the violence you see is violence from caseworkers. And so I'm curious how you reconcile that, because a lot of our attempts at trauma-informed services go through caseworkers. And I think I found that insight, your early insight, important. Thanks.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. And if you do any research with people who are poor, I'm sure you have also heard complaint beyond complaint about how people are treated in the county assistance office. So it's pretty phenomenal that the Department of Human Services, which used to be the Department of Welfare before they changed their name, actually decided to partner with us on doing our trauma-informed program called the Building Wealth and Health Network. And we felt that if we could get going with showing how trauma-informed care and trauma-informed peer support would actually work, that we could change the culture within welfare itself, within the welfare system itself. And while they're open to hearing about the importance of trauma-informed engagement, trauma-informed organizational practices, it takes a long time for state administrators to figure out how to do that and how to mandate it and provide the training for county assistance office officials and things like that. Our staff at the Center for Hunger-Free Communities, Ali Huxta and Janae Smith, have created a whole training program for frontline caseworkers to do trauma-informed care. So if you have an interest in learning more about that, we have started to do this in Pennsylvania. It's a slow unfreezing process, and there's no incentive for caseworkers to do it. And the system itself is a traumatizing system in which frontline caseworkers are often reprimanded or punished if they are super nice to their clients and are, somehow not complying with rules and regulations. So it takes a systematic approach in terms of leadership. The leadership has to buy in, and also the frontline has to buy in. So it takes time to do that type of training. I've tried to convince at the national level the Agency for Children and Families to pick up a trauma-informed approach. And this is an ongoing unfreezing process, but skating without the skates tends to melt a little bit on the surface. I think I'm getting somewhere, but it's taking way too long. Thanks for the question.
Other questions online? Yeah, Ellen, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Anyway, thank you for that elaboration. It's really good to see your face in person. And can you just elaborate more on where human right to food advocates and anti-hunger advocates should be entering? What are some of the partnerships they should be pursuing?
Thank you so much for the question. It's great to see you, Ellen, and thank you so much for all of your work on the right to food. And you've been an inspiration to me, and so I'm really grateful that you're asking the question. I think at the national level, it's a moot point at this current time. I think our Congress is very is concerned with other things, which I have a really hard time keeping. I used to feel like I had my finger on the pulse. I have no sense of the pulse at the federal level. I'm really impressed with the folks who are working with Via Campesina, and there's a bunch of advocates whose organizations I can't quite remember, but there's a bunch of folks, I think including Andy Fisher and others, who are starting to get state legislators to imbue this state constitution with the concept of the right to food. So Maine was the first to go. In Maine, in the state constitution, there is a right to food. It's primarily focused on helping people not be penalized if they want to make their own pies and sell them from their porch or from their gardens, or to share their own food. So it's about making sure it's an edge toward food sovereignty. It's getting more localized control in the community over the food system, and being able to share food and to sell food and to engage in more solidarity economies. So anything that people can do to connect with the food sovereignty movement, that's the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, Campesina, and starting to work with local farmers, people who are trying to decolonize. There are a bunch of folks all around the country, Black farmers, Indigenous farmers, and young people into farming, who would be very interested, I think, in joining in on the right to food and bringing in this concept of the solidarity economy and engaging more on again, food sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty. So I think these state ideas, in the state constitutions could be exciting. I think there's a lot more to be done.
Great. Will you have a question? Is there? No, it doesn't. Any questions? Oh, okay, go ahead. There, I see a hand.
Hi, yeah, I do have a question. I really appreciate the depth of your work. And I feel like this is the kind of work that needs to happen for real transformative change. And so I'm curious about how this connects to your career in academia and how you felt, because I know that you talked about how hard it is to get researchers to get on board with the changes that you're proposing. So I'm curious about how you've managed to continue within academia, if you think that that's important, and like, where is this kind of work best coming from? And then also thinking about sustainability, right? So funding and publishing, et cetera.
Thank you so much. That's such a great question. This is a lifelong learning process. I don't do it well. And it's been a little tough in the world of academia, but it is possible to do it. One of the ways that we've been able to do it at Drexel is that Drexel was founded years ago by one of our founding dean, Jonathan Mann, who insisted on merging human rights and public health together. And that he left an indelible imprint. He died soon after he joined the faculty at our school. But that ethos has still remained at our university, at the School of Public Health at Drexel. Another way I've been able to do it is by finding the right funders and having the courage to tell them the truth about what I think is going on. You're going to scare away some funders, but some funders might come towards you and start to think about, okay, yes, you can do this. And so you need to find some friends. You need to find your people. We're around. Someone like Fred Moten talks about the undercommons. In academia, there are a bunch of really creative and wonderful people all across the country and around the world who are doing creative work, but we find ways to squirrel away funding, et cetera. And I think that when I was able to found the Center for Hunger-Free Communities in 2004, I worked also really hard to train my staff in trauma-informed approaches. I found money to do that. And a lot of it is foundation funding. I gave up on trying to get NIH funding because I just felt like they would want me to do brain scans. I couldn't get into the NIH frame. So there are foundations that you can tap into that can support your work. And I just have to say that there were times when I was very much discouraged from having the Grow Clinic. People said you shouldn't be testifying before Congress. It's a waste of your time. It's not academic unless you're writing about it. I got some really bogus advice throughout the years. But what I always did is I relied on my gut and what felt important to me and to the research participants. And I feel like that integrity and staying true to the research participants, staying true to my heart, to my mind, and to my friends and my colleagues and mentors helped me to have the courage and the guts to stand up for what I believed in. And actually, I feel like that courage is what allowed me to get to become full professor. Yes, I have published in peer-reviewed journal articles, et cetera. I'm doing the thing, but at the same time, I'm not losing my integrity. So meditation and finding your people and get the foundations behind you. NIH at this current time is not going to do it. And I'm sorry for those NIH folks who are online. If you are a program officer at the NIH listening in, maybe you can find ways to find more money for researchers in academia. You can do it.
Hopefully the NIH programmer can hear that. And okay, it's about the time at 1:15, and the last remark is really I cannot really agree more. So thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you everyone to join the call. Thank you.
Thank you very much.